May 28, 1901, Muzaffar al-Din Shah Qajar, the Shah, an autocratic ruler of Iran, had granted an oil concession to a British entrepreneur named William Knox Darcy. The concession granted Darcy the exclusive rights to explore, exploit and refine oil in Iran. The concession was made valid for 60 years on the condition that the Shah would receive 16% of all the profits. Almost exactly 7 years later, on May 26th, Darcy finally struck oil. A year later, on April 14th, 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed to begin refining and selling the oil. The company is now known today as BP, British Petroleum. By the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Anglo-Persian was exporting over 274,000 tons of oil annually, more oil than Anglo-Persian could handle. With the start of World War I looming closer, the British government began to take an interest in Anglo-Persian, as it sought to convert its Royal Navy from coal to oil. On May 20th, 1914, an agreement was made between the British government and Anglo-Persian. The British government would invest £2.2 million into the company, and in return would receive 51% of its stocks. The British government now owned a majority share, which effectively nationalised the company. Britain's oil interests had been secured, and would prove vital to Britain's victory during World War I, which would break out just over a month later. By 1950, 40% of the West's oil was being produced in Iran, and 75% of Europe's. This reliance on Iranian oil had caused the British to become deeply entrenched in Iran's politics. Meanwhile, the United States began to find its own oil interests under threat. Following threats by Venezuela to nationalize its own oil, Creole Oil, a subsidiary of the American oil company, Standard Oil of New Jersey, was forced to concede a 50-50 split of its profits. 2 years later, following similar threats by Saudi Arabia in 1950, Arabian American oil company Aramco was also forced into a 50-50 agreement with the Saudi government. Britain would soon find itself in a similar predicament. Inspired by the developments in Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, the Iranians too began to demand a fairer share of the profits. The demand for a revision of the concession, giving Iran 50% of the profits and a larger role in the management of the company, were rejected by Britain. On January 11, 1951, the National Front, a moderate nationalist party headed by Mohammad Mossadegh, proposed the nationalisation of Iran's oil. As support for nationalisation grew, Britain eventually conceded to discuss a 50-50 share of the profits. However, it was now too late. On March 15th, the Majlis, Iran's democratically elected National Assembly, unanimously approved Iran's oil nationalisation. Nationalisation was then later approved by the Iranian Senate on March 20th. Following the resignation of the Prime Minister on April 27th, Mossadegh was appointed as the new Prime Minister. Britain was already busy attempting to overthrow Mossadegh itself. In February 1953, an anti-Mossadegh rebellion by Bakhtiari tribal leaders, instigated and armed by MI6 and the Shah, was crushed by the government. The same month, on February 28th, Ayatollah Chari, a British-backed Shia cleric and rival to Mossadegh, organised a mob to march on Mossadegh's home. The mob broke into his home and threatened to kill him. Mossadegh escaped over the back wall in his pyjamas. It became clear that neither Britain or the Shah alone possessed the power to overthrow Mossadegh. In March 1953, a new round of discussions began between MI6 and CIA officials in Washington. Operation Boot was modified and renamed Operation Ajax. The plan was finalized and then approved by both the British and the Americans in mid-June. The plan comprised of 4 main components. The first was to begin a propaganda campaign portraying Mossadegh as a communist. The second, to encourage the opposition to create disturbances. The third, to pressure the Shah to remove Mossadegh from power and select a new Prime Minister. And fourth, to support Fazlollah Zahidi as Mossadegh's replacement. With the propaganda campaign and support for the opposition well underway, General H. Norman Schwarzkopf arrived in Iran on August 1st, armed with large bags filled with millions of US dollars. Schwarzkopf met with Zahidi and the Shah to assure them of US support. Roosevelt also entered Iran secretly under alias James Lockbridge, and on the same day met with the Shah to discuss the execution of Operation Ajax. The Shah was to issue a decree to dismiss Mossadegh and replace him with Zahedi. On August 15th, the commander of the Imperial Guards, accompanied by 3 truckloads of soldiers, arrived at Mossadegh's home to issue his dismissal. Mossadegh's guards overwhelmed the soldiers and called for the immediate arrest of Zahedi, who was being hidden by the US in its embassy compound. The Shah, upon hearing of the coup's failure, fled to Baghdad, and the US began drawing up plans to pull Zahedi and Roosevelt out of the country. Roosevelt, hoping to make use of the failed coup attempt, hired a large crowd at a cost of $50,000 to pose as communist Tudor members and riot through the streets of Tehran, attacking mosques and statues of the Shah. Roosevelt also stepped up the propaganda campaign to link Mossadegh with the rioting communists. In preparation for the second coup attempt, the CIA began bribing army and police officials. August 19th was the date set by the CIA for its next attempt to overthrow Mossadegh. On the morning of August 19th, the same mob, hired 2 days earlier to pose as communist rioters, entered the center of Tehran and began threatening and intimidating passers-by and drivers to display pictures of the Shah. The police, having already been paid off, failed to intervene. The mob, then armed with knives, clubs, chains and sticks, began marching on Mossadegh's house. The CIA had told the mob to do everything possible to ensure the mob get as much attention as possible. Taking the advice rather literally, the mob had hired wrestlers, tumblers, jugglers and clowns. Zahedi came out of hiding from the US Embassy and drove to the state radio station to announce his takeover. The Shah's Imperial Guards began attacking Mossadegh's house with artillery, Sherman tanks and bazookas. Mossadegh had once again managed to escape over the back wall. The ensuing battle between the Imperial Guards, the hired mob and Mossadegh's guards claimed over 300 lives. Among those killed were the hired mob members who had been found with money still in their pockets, given to them that very morning by CIA agents. The same day, Zahedi declared himself Prime Minister, and the following day Mossadegh surrendered himself to the Shah's forces. With Mossadegh finally removed from power, an estimated $7 million had been spent on the CIA operation. Zahedi immediately imposed martial law and began rounding up and executing nationalist leaders. Mossadegh himself was spurred execution by the US's request and was sentenced to 3 years solitary confinement, and would live the rest of his life under house arrest until his death on March 5th, 1967.
Now, Kermit actually hired people to argue both sides of the issue in the streets, right, in order to create the illusion that there was a whole lot of unrest going on.
This was a wonderful part of Kermit Roosevelt's plan. Not only did he buy out newspapers to have print articles about how evil Mossadegh was and have religious leaders denouncing Mossadegh as an atheist and create this whole public opinion campaign, but he also hired a mob of thugs to run through the streets of Tehran and beat up pedestrians, fire shots into stores, and break windows and shout, "We love Mossadegh, we love communism." And it wasn't enough to do that. Kermit Roosevelt had an even better idea, that he would hire a second mob to attack this first mob. The idea was that this would create the impression that Tehran had fallen into complete chaos and that the government was no longer able to control the situation. I don't think that the people fighting on either side of those gang wars really understood that they were all working for the CIA.